The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. Okay, all those of you who listen regularly, you know that this is a live call-in show. You are welcome and encouraged to call in with your thoughts and comments on the topic of the night. The only rule is that you be respectful and voice your thoughts as opinions or ideas or what you've read. Just, don't get on and rant and do the right-wing talk radio thing. Anyway, the number here is 343-9927, 343-9927. If you're outside the calling area and listening or live streaming on WHYR.org, call the area code 225, then 343-9927. Okay, our topic for tonight is a book that Lang, Baker, and I have read. Did you read it, Kendall? I know you said you were trying to. Or...
I read most of it.
Good. Okay. The book is titled Incognito, The Secret Lives of Our Brain. And it goes into a description in layman's terms of just how much work our brains do that we're not aware of. And these things that it does that we don't know about manifest themselves in our everyday lives without us even realizing it, unless we read this book, or other books or whatever. And before I go too much further, I'd like to welcome Lang Baker. Good evening, Lang.
Hi, Wayne.
And Kendall Losey.
Good evening.
You made it with the traffic, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Lang and I have both read the book before, and then I've been rereading it. I almost said rereading again, but that would be redundancy, I think. But anyway, Kendall, you read a good bit of it. I'm sure you've read more than what we're going to be able to cover tonight.
Okay.
But like I said, the premise of the book was how much work our brains do without us even knowing it. Well, how much work do our brains do without even knowing it?
Untold amounts of work. I'm guessing half of the book that I've gone through, it's amazing how much our brain does without us even knowing about it.
Yeah, that's a neat thing. It just fills in stuff. I think the book somewhere says 99% of our brain's activity. Lang, do you remember?
I don't remember.
I know it's in the 90s that our brains are constantly working, and we don't even know it. And that's the amazing thing about it. One of the examples that I made a note of from the book was an experiment that was conducted with men. They were shown a series of photographs, 8x10 glossies probably, of women's faces, and asked to judge them by their attractiveness. And unbeknownst to them, for half the women, their pupils were dilated, which is a sign of sexual arousal. I never knew that. I don't pay attention to that stuff. I just pay attention if I'm sexually aroused or not, right? But anyway, what they found was the men overwhelmingly chose the women with the dilated pupils as being attractive, and presumably they have other reasons to know that it was because they were, the sexual stimulation signal was there to the men somewhere in their subconscious, and they just naturally found those women more attractive. And that goes on without us knowing about it. They talk here about jealousy, attraction, or love of fatty foods, or even great ideas that we have seemingly out of nowhere that we claim credit for, but we didn't really achieve through any kind of conscious thought. Any thoughts on that, Lang?
Well, I think it's fascinating how we respond to clues, to inputs that we're not consciously aware of. That's one example of it. And I think he hits on it in parts of this book about how this response mechanism is a product of long evolutionary process.
Yes.
And so it's what what individuals respond to is what has over time been advantageous for passing that genetic material on to the next generation.
Yeah, it's ironic, though, that some of those things we can take, and I've taken, to extremes to our detriment. You know, we end up hurting ourselves with some of these things, and I don't want to go into anything in specific concerning myself, but you know, if you're too much of a jealous person, if you're too attracted to somebody, you kind of, you know, you can scare them away or whatever. You know, there's stuff like that. How about when we're trying to remember a name or some specific thing while we're talking to somebody, and it just won't come to us, and or the person we're talking to suffers from the same thing, and we just say, okay, stop thinking about it and go on to something else, and then all of a sudden that thought pops into our brains. You know, they mention that in the book too. You know, they basically state that the brain is constantly working on all kinds of things, you know, and I've found that it's even things that I'm not focusing on consciously at all and hadn't focused on probably in previous weeks, when all of a sudden an idea pops into my head. And that's all a result of unconscious processes going on in our pumpkin heads.
Yeah, a lot more goes on subconsciously that, you know, than consciously, than that we give credit to. When we try to recall anything, or if we're trying to do, like they said in sports, for example, they gave the example of the tennis player who doesn't think about whether they should go with a forehand or a backhand serve, or I mean, a lob.
Right. Yeah. Whatever. That's
And or any sport at all, and they, you know, it's not that the athlete sees the game slower than the regular person, but that they have trained themselves subconsciously by repetition and training themselves and incrementally changing everything that you know, as they train, the brain has trained itself to do things subconsciously that, you know, because if you thought about it consciously, you would already be a step behind.
Yeah, right. And in fact, I wrote down one of the examples from sports, and this shows, I guess, how long ago the book was written, because they talk about how a Nolan Ryan fastball was clocked at 101 miles per hour, and they said that the time it takes from the time it leaves its hand until it reaches the plate is shorter than the time required for the batter to consciously see the ball and swing.
Right.
But yet batters hit balls all the time. So what they say is that the brain is doing all those calculations and seeing those things way faster than their conscious mind, and you don't even know it. You just do it, like you're saying with the tennis player, Kendall. And that's just fascinating to me.
Just a quick correction.
Sure.
This book was written in 2011, so it was only 5 years old.
Wow.
Nolan Ryan, however, is a timeless sporting person. So
you're a smart aleck, I guess. Okay. Well, no, that's cool though. But yeah, I you know, I presume that I'm an old man. So Nolan Ryan, I remember him when he played. So, you know, and I'm no longer a big baseball fan. But anyway, getting back to the ideas coming to us, I know that for me, go ahead, Lang.
When you described the batter and the pitch,
Yeah.
reminded me of an interview I heard on NPR in the last few months about by someone who's been studying how batters can respond to pitchers, and part of their response is not to the ball but to the body language of the pitcher before he lets go of the pitch. And in their studies, they show when they match these great professional batters up against women softball pitchers who had an entirely different kind of body language, they were terrible hitters.
How about that? So there's even more information that's going on that our brain is calculating and observing that we are totally unaware of. That's cool. Yeah, one of the points they make is that the conscious thoughts that we have are basically headlines from our brain's activity, much like a newspaper's headline is for the articles that they, preface, because they try to come up with headlines that give a basic summary of what the article is about to catch your attention. And what happens to us is basically all the attention our brains pay to a subject goes on without us knowing it, and then we get hit with the headline, and that's what we think is the sum total of what we thought of, Right. They mention here an account, Nikola Tesla, who is someone I would like to talk about sometime in the future in depth, particularly the autobiography or the biography of him I read. But anyway, I do want to remind, before I continue to blather on about this, to remind our listeners to call in if you'd like at 343-9927, 343-9927. If you're outside the calling area, call the area code 225-343-9927 and share your thoughts and ideas and perspectives with us. Getting back to Nikola Tesla, okay, I think you both probably know he was one of the most important inventors of the world, really, and he invented all kinds of things, most notably the brushless alternating current motor. Right. And he says, I was reading his autobiography, which is actually a very short book, but he doesn't hold back on his self-praise or whatever you want to call it. He was pretty proud of himself, or pretty impressed with himself, and perhaps he should have been. But he said that he'd been stumped for a long time about how to make this brushless motor. He had conceived it or thought of the idea and believed it to be possible, but the actual design had escaped him. And he was walking through the park, or a park, with a friend of his one time, reciting, I think it was a passage from Goethe's Faust, is what he said in his autobiography. And he said while he's reciting this passage, this thought flashed into his mind, and he grabbed a stick and drew the diagram for his motor in the dirt in the park and showed it to his friend. And his friend readily understood what he was talking about when he did it. But just in a flash, when he wasn't even thinking about the whole thing, it came to him, and he very quickly wrote it down. And I wonder if we can achieve or obtain profound insight, so to speak, even if we don't think about issues, but just read and take in information. Do either of you have an idea with that? I mean, if all this stuff is going on without us knowing it, and we're not consciously trying to come to any conclusions about anything, but yet a conclusion pops into our heads, is it possible that just a simple accumulation of knowledge in our brains could end up forming into an idea that we become aware of?
I think that that's generally probably what happens, because we consciously, gather information, as we go along, right? But that sometimes those things may be unrelated, but as the brain works its, not magic, but it works its processes, it just turns just random things. It just pulls all of the knowledge, whether that's from what we've gathered or what has been gathered before we were born as well, because there's a lot of instinct pre-programmed into our brain. At least that's what I was reading towards the end of when I left off.
Okay.
But that a lot of it just kind of pulls together and becomes forms into an idea.
Okay. Yeah, I read that too. Lang, do you recall anything specific from the book on that, or anywhere else?
Well, I would say my personal experience back when I was in junior high, our math teacher would give us brain teasers, puzzles to work on for extra credit. And I can remember one in particular. I was not getting anywhere with it, but I had been focusing on it a lot, and it was given us one day, would come in with our answers the next day, and in the middle of the night I woke up with the image that solved this problem. It was a geometry type of a math problem,
Yeah.
so it lent itself to seeing a visual presentation of the solution, and it's a sense that the mind in the dream state or in the unconscious can be processing information that it's been fed, and then something springs up into consciousness out of that processing that's been going on.
Yeah.
Also reminded me of, I believe, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who woke up from a dream, and this poem, he just poured it out. It had come to him where he couldn't write fast enough to get it all down, is my recollection. What he wrote down was as much as he could get down before it
I
kind of
think
evaporated from his consciousness.
I think, wasn't he under the influence of LSD at that time? I think, according to I think what that was mentioned in this book, there was somebody that did that.
Yeah, it was opiates or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, yeah. And actually, not that I'm any Samuel Taylor Coleridge, but I've thought of poems, a few anyway, in my lifetime, and one in particular popped into my mind and began popping in one or two lines at a time. And before I could write them down, like I'd be driving along in a car, not really thinking about writing a poem, and before I could write them down, the next line would come in, and I just kept, and the whole poem just basically wrote itself out of me. But it's interesting you brought up the mathematical example, Lang, because one of the notes I managed to take from the book was a little talk about how in 1824 Johann Friedrich Herbart, who I believe was some smart scientist. I didn't write down exactly what he was, but he theorized that ideas that are being worked on in our subconscious mind are either progressively elevated to consciousness or defeated and kept below it with sort of a structured mathematical framework. He postulated or theorized that if an idea pops into the head, ideas pop into our brain all the time, probably a lot without us even knowing it at first, or we have a lot of information in our brain just bouncing around doing nothing. But if a certain idea begins in our thought processes and is subsequently confirmed by more and more other pieces of information, it begins to grow and get stronger and get elevated and eventually reach our consciousness. Whereas an idea that is a dud will encounter information or other ideas in the process that counter it, and they hold it back, and it just never gets up to the conscious level. So that could be a part of it too. It's just, Kendall, I saw a light bulb go on.
I wanted to see. I'll pose a question probably.
Okay.
The ideas that we come up with and become a dud. Could that possibly be because of we think about it too much, or was it just, or maybe the subconscious thought, well, this was a good idea, maybe you didn't do it right?
That is a good point. I have a somewhat similar personal experience on that very thing, Lang, but I wanted to give you a chance. You want to jump? Okay. Years ago, many years ago, when I was working in my so-called successful career in the nuclear power industry, at one point I realized consciously that my future was not there. But I didn't leave. For some reason I knew that it was because I got a call from another power plant where I'd visited for some project, and the guy called me up and offered me a job, and I thought to myself, well, that place won't be any different from here, just farther from my friends and all, so why should I change jobs? And that, years later, I realized was a sign that I had logically already concluded that I was not going to stay in the industry or not stay where I was. But 5 years later, just walking down the hall one day at work, a feeling came over me, and all of a sudden I knew I'm leaving. And all I could think of was that the conscious thought was out there, but it wasn't supported by anything, and that was such a big move to make that I didn't dare do it just on logic alone. It didn't feel right, right. But all of a sudden, when it felt right, I had no doubt, and I put in my notice and walked out of there 2 weeks later, and didn't know where I was going, but I knew I was leaving there, and it was just one of those decisions. But
You felt you made the right decision?
I have never regretted it.
Oh,
Never.
okay.
I gave up the retirement and the so-called security, all that stuff, but I don't care. The learning and growing I went through as a result of getting out of that environment, or any fixed and protected environment, did me a wonderful benefit. You're listening to A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio 96.9. This is Wayne Parker. We're discussing David Eagleman's book, Incognito, The Secret Lies of the Brain. So if you'd like to call in and share your ideas and thoughts, perspectives, please do at 343-9927, 343-9927. I'd like to go back to another account that they described in the book, or that David Eagleman described in the book. He said that Renaissance painters, when was that, back in the late 19th century? Renaissance? Oh, come on, Lang, you're cultured. No, huh? Okay. Well, it was a long time ago.
The Renaissance, wasn't that in the 1500s?
Man, I don't know. I just know there were Renaissance painters, because I've heard them referred to before. You think he's right, Lang? Okay, it was a long time ago. Anyway, the Renaissance painters noticed at some point during their artistry that the distant mountains appeared to be tinted a bit blue. And that fact had been in front of them and everyone else in the world since the mountains and people had been around, and nobody had ever noticed it before. But once they called it out and put it in paintings, people realized it. They could see it. And they asked the question, why do we fail to perceive these obvious things? Are we really such poor observers of our own experiences? And they answered the question, yes, we are astoundingly poor observers. And it all depends on how closely we look at something, what frame of mind we're in, I guess. And it occurred to me that illustrates the importance of positive attitudes toward life and trying to keep an open mind, or a mind that's as open as it can possibly be. Because our brain's going to filter what we see one way or another, and we may as well opt for a filter that lets in broader perspectives, I guess, for lack of a better way to describe it. I know that, I would suspect that with a negative perspective, we would tend to take in negative inputs, which would then color the way we think and the ideas we have and things like that. I'm seeing nodding heads, so...
Yeah, I'm recalling another book, Molecules of Emotion, where one of the observations described in there is how when our brain is in a negative state, it tends to remember experiences that reinforce that perception of the world, that orientation towards the world.
Ooh.
So, for instance, someone who's really depressed can only remember experiences that are depressing. And when a person's in a real joyful state, those are the things they remember.
Well, can they go back? Yeah, go ahead.
And that's reminding me of some other studies I saw where a person who's intoxicated has some experiences, and then they can't remember that later.
Right.
Unless they're intoxicated again. And then their brain's in that state and can recall the things that happened when they were intoxicated before.
Makes sense.
So it's like, depending on the brain chemistry that's in control at the moment, those are the kinds of things we tend to be more likely to be able to recall and to interpret our experiences in the moment through that lens.
Yeah, interesting. It's almost as though the central brain, as it were, has different modes of operation or something.
Yeah, there's a comment in here where he's having a conversation with a woman who is talking about how she has her monthly cycle of moods, and she says, boy, a few days every month I'm like this. This isn't my normal self. And then she's a scientist like him. She stops and says, well, wait a minute. Maybe this is my normal self and the rest is not my normal self.
Yeah.
And he says, well, maybe we don't have a normal self, or maybe our normal self is kind of some kind of average or something like that of all these different states that we pass through, moment by moment or day by day or however it works.
Yeah, and that coincides, too, with different ways that we perceive the world at any different time. I've known a police detective who said if you ask 10 eyewitnesses to an accident, what happened, you'll get 10 different stories. You know, and I recall a quote from Heavy Metal Magazine, like back in the late 70s, early 80s, where one of the characters said, reality is nothing more than the least common denominator of the human imagination. And I wonder if what we perceive as our normal selves is the least common denominator of everything we normally see ourselves doing. And I guess because the woman's monthly cycle was relatively brief compared to the length of time that she exhibited the other behavior, she just automatically assumed that was not normal, when it, I guess, would have to have been normal in a certain way. I mean, if you take the whole month together as one, segment of time, she's just showing a different part of herself at that time or whatever,
Yeah, well, it brings up the whole question of what is the self really?
Yeah.
And in one of his chapters in there, he gets on to the topic of what is consciousness. And he kind of, as I understand it, describes consciousness, one way of viewing consciousness as being kind of like the CEO, where we have all these automated routines that are running in our brain, or refers to them as zombie programs that are running. And it's like we become conscious when there's a conflict between what these different programs want to do or what they're trying to execute. And so is the self the sum total of all this, or is the self the conscious part that's trying to navigate in the conflicts? Or I guess in one sense it comes down to definition of terms. What we want to understand is
and
who we are.
I'd have to say that, who we are, I guess, would have to be everything, I would think, not just the brain, but, our bodies and everything else, the holistic approach, so to speak, to use a big and fancy word. I think that's big and fancy. But, I think our cells are really composed of our entire entity, I don't know any other way to describe that. But talking about consciousness and reality, I'm reminded of, and they mention this in Incognito too, but I read the book years ago before I read Incognito about a guy named Mike May, who lost his sight when he was 3 years old. He was blinded by a chemical explosion. He got into some chemicals in the attic of a new house that they'd been moved to, and he lost his eyesight. And 40 years later, he was able to regain sight in one eye with a corneal transplant. And everybody, including him, expected him to just, okay, his eye is back, he'll be able to see normally now. And he couldn't. He couldn't perceive a lot of things. One of the first things they noticed was he didn't recognize his kids when they were brought into the room, when the bandage was removed from his eye. And it was because he couldn't recognize faces. He didn't have the information stored in his brain that his brain could use to compare all of these light pulses that were received by his eyes and interpret them as something. And what they illustrated was, both in that book and in Incognito, is that all our eyes do, we don't see with our eyes. All that our eyes do is have gamma rays, light rays, impacted on the retina, and the retina converts those to electrical pulses, and the combination of pulses goes to the brain and looks around for something that causes that pattern of electrical pulses and creates an image in your brain. And what they also show with one of their tricks, and we don't have time to illustrate it now, but if the brain is missing something that it's expecting, it will put it there.
Yeah.
And I thought that was totally cool. And by the same token, I've noticed it with riding motorcycles and learning about motorcycle safety. We tend to see what we're looking for, like people tell us, and most people don't see motorcycles coming down the road. When they go to look to pull out from in an intersection, they're looking for cars. Their brain is looking for cars. And if they look down the road and only a motorcycle is coming, their brain registers no car and they pull out because they don't see the bike. Right. And it's the same phenomenon. We have images in our brain that we expect to see, and that's what we see, unless we're very careful. And that can certainly impact our everyday lives, and not just with motorcyclists, but in all kinds of things. Okay, we're about out of time. As usual, it's been a good discussion for me anyway. I don't know about all of those listening out there in the audience, but we thank you for listening. You've been listening to Wayne Parker, Kendall Losey, and Lang Baker on Baton Rouge Community Radio. This is the Pause for Thought, 96.9 FM in Baton Rouge, and you guys have a good evening.